In one of the social media groups that I follow, I saw this article linked called Norse Code, Are White Supremacists Reading Too Much into the Northman? And I thought it would be a good idea, as there have been a few articles and claims made that the Northman is emboldening white supremacists, or may even have underlying messages to such white supremacists, to make a video about this topic. This is partially in response to these articles, but I think more than that, this is in response to actual people who do identify as white supremacists and who think that the Northman justifies or emboldens their own claims and their ideas of what the Viking Age would like. In essence, this is a rebuke to such claims. The article goes on to show some of the ways in which Norse culture and history has been misappropriated by white supremacist groups in the past. For an overview of how such white supremacist groups have used the Viking Age past for their own ends, my friend Jimmy at the Welsh Viking has a good video on this from the 1930s, 40s and onwards, which I'll link below. But what I think is a good way to approach this topic is in particular to hone in on this paragraph. It's taken from the far-right site Stormfront, from a contribution in 2001, which laid out a thread on content that white nationalists should be watching and enjoying for particular reasons. Now, I'll quickly paraphrase here that these reasons, that what makes a good white nationalist or white supremacist film, includes positive portrayal of whites in defense against the depredations of liberalism and attack by alien races, positive portrayal of heterosexual relationships and sex, marriage, procreation and child rearing, portrayals of white males as intelligent, sensitive and strong in positive leadership roles and or romantic leads, and practically intense portrayals of white female beauty in non-degrading roles. Disqualifying themes include homosexuality, racial mixing, negative portrayals of Christianity, and portrayals of white people as inferior. Now, what I have some grievance with, of course, this list, I don't think that particularly makes a good or a bad film on its own, but that the writer of this article goes on to say, the Northman pretty much ticks all these boxes, but then so do many other movies. So considering the time period, we don't really have any examples of liberalism in a political sense anywhere in this film. And really, when we look at the hero Amleth, especially when he's part of the warband in the scenes in Gardariki, so in Eastern Europe, and later in Iceland, he's actually the one that is committing crime. So he's not exactly portraying crime in a bad sense, as he is committing crimes against defenseless people a lot of the time, and indeed against those who he feels have wronged his family. Now, unless we're treating the Slavs here as an alien race, then there's nothing that really constitutes a tick to this point, especially because the Slavs are given a human voice personified in the character of Olga, as well as having a spotlight shone on their character, their culture, and specifically their religious ideas through Olga. I don't think that really counts as a kind of alien race being shown in the film. So the males in the film are many things, but particularly intelligent and sensitive. These aren't particularly words that I would associate with the male characters in The Northman. Certainly on the sensitive side, that seems to be almost entirely missing when it comes to the film's males, perhaps even mostly so in the film's hero Amleth.
Son of King Arvan and Warraven, and I am his
who literally shoves aside his family to be and all of that just to pursue vengeance. He spends the entirety of the film, right from the moment when his father is killed until the very end where he dies, pursuing that vengeance. He isn't particularly sensitive to anything. Maybe the fact that he says, I won't kill women, not even her, when referring to his mother is meant to show a more sensitive side, but it doesn't really come across very strongly. Certainly the other males in the story, thinking even of the slaves playing the game where they're battering each other, thinking of the guardsman that, will hunt down a child and then lose a nose in the process, they also don't really come across as particularly more sensitive and intelligent. I would in fact argue that in good Icelandic saga style, it's the women of the film that are shown to be far more intelligent. Specifically those that are given larger roles, Olga and Gudrun specifically, they are the ones that are often manipulating and planning, and they use their influence with men for their own ends. Just think of the fact that Gudrun literally begs Fjolnir to kill her abusive husband so that they can escape. She goads him to action. Similarly, Olga, if you take a slightly more cynical view of Olga's role, Amleth is her ticket out of slavery, and indeed she does get out of it while Amleth dies. So to a certain extent, Olga has actually used the cunning of her mind, as she says at some point in the film, to get away from her enslaved situation and to become free once again. All the males in leadership roles are also deeply flawed. Amleth's father, King Arvandil, is revealed to have been an adulterous rapist, and Fjolnir obviously kills his own brother and proves as an ineffective leader because he loses his kingdom soon after and ends up being a sheep farmer in Iceland. So whether these white males, as the article says, obviously everyone in the film is white, as has been pointed out, so I've just gone for male in this case, they can't really be described as incredibly good leadership positions or particularly skilled leaders, and Amleth barely takes on the role of leader because he's mostly taking on his own revenge and his own plot rather than leading other people throughout the film. So there is something of a question about the women in the film being in non-degrading roles. Well, the vast majority of women in the film are enslaved people, several of whom end up being killed on a whim or who have to endure the sexual advances of Fjolnir. You know, Olga only escapes by smearing menstrual fluid on his face just to get him to leave her alone. Then we also have the other female character in the film, Gudrun, has to endure enslavement and sexual abuse at the hands of her husband, Alvandil, as is revealed at the end of the film, and then live a rough existence in Iceland when her new husband's fortunes fail. So again, that's pretty tough on the women in the film, and a lot of them do seem to be in fairly degrading situations but manage to get out of it because of their own cunning and intelligence, which doesn't really square up with what is said on the Stormfront site of what belongs in a strongly white supremacist film. So there are no real examples of homosexuality in the film, but there is something else that's quite interesting, which is the witch character that Amleth goes to see before he gets his magical sword, Droiger, is clearly male, though what he's wearing is actually traditional female clothing from the Viking Age, specifically talking here about the hangarok, the kind of dress that's being worn, and the tortoiseshell brooches, if I remember correctly, the type of brooch from the film, as well as performing what I assume to be the practice of seidr. Now, what's interesting about this practice, and in fact more broadly the practice of divination and witchcraft in Norse society, from what we can glean, is that several sources point to this practice being highly associated with females, and indeed that the god Odin, the Allfather, often assumed to be the most powerful of the gods in the Aesir, that his involvement in it is strongly criticized, and it's clearly a source of shame that targets specifically his masculinity and his standing as a man. Now, I assume that this element with the he-witch in the Northman has come from the advice of Neil Price, who has written about this and who I know was one of the historical advisors on the film. And in fact, you can see his touch throughout the Northman in various points. Would make for an interesting drinking game if you've read The Children of Ash and El. But basically what I'm trying to say here is that I assume that it's from his influence that he has been included in the film in the way that he is, and as such we might from a modern perspective label this person, this witch, this male who was wearing traditionally female clothing and who is performing what was probably a female's role in the Viking Age, we might label them someone who traversed the traditional borders of gender roles, and we might perhaps today call that person transgender. Now, it's difficult to obviously label someone from the past because perhaps we are completely off the mark with this kind of thing because our modern values and ideas, they often don't map onto the past, particularly when we don't have a good idea of how they were viewing themselves. But based on what I've read from Neil Price, I think that is what they are aiming for with this character and the way that they have developed him. And so I would argue that while there isn't homosexuality, that is a nod to transgender people in the Northman. So in terms of actual racial mixing, we don't see that in the Northman, but I think that's because the film follows the trend of staying true to the historical narrative and things we know about the period. Now, that isn't to say that this never occurred in the Viking Age. In fact, I'm sure that there were places and times where people of what we consider to be different racial groups, people with different skin colors, will have got together and had children. But that wasn't the norm in the Viking Age. That wasn't the fact that people thought that there was something particularly wrong with that. In fact, it's hard to say whether we know if people thought there was something wrong with that or not, but simply that most people in Northern Europe at the time will have been white. And indeed, in the places where the Northman takes place, Scandinavia, the rivers of Eastern Europe, and Iceland, indeed, the chances of meeting someone with, recognizably of a different race would be really quite small. Not impossible. We, of course, know that there were people coming from Arabia, there were people coming from North Africa into places like Dorestad in Frisia, into Anglo-Saxon England, of course also into Scandinavia. The Scandinavians themselves would sail along the coasts of Africa, they would go into places like Arabia, and in North America they would meet, the ancestors of Native American peoples. But of course, none of that happens in the Northman, and I think that's an accurate portrayal. It's not to say that it's impossible or that we can't have people of different races in such films. That's not what I believe at all, but I'm just saying that's the reason why in the Northman you don't see it, because the chances would have been fairly small. But what we do see a lot of in the Northman, and what is absolutely right for the Viking Age, is people of different cultural groups mixing, because that was happening all the time in the Viking world. Now, these were people that we would today recognize as being white, so not from a different race, but a lot of the times they had different cultural background, they may have a different ethnic background, different religious backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, and they would probably view each other as being of, let's say, a different group to themselves. And we know that the Vikings, they spread across large parts of Europe and indeed beyond, and so will have met and intermarried with these peoples. What's really interesting is that Amleth's future children are literally going to be a mix, because of course he is a Scandinavian, a Norseman, and their mother is Slavic. But what's actually interesting is that if you read into it a little bit more, Olga's name actually comes from the Old Norse Helga, the male form being Helgi, related to the word holy in English, which already implies that Olga is of mixed race, or, well, I'm not sure if you can call it mixed race, but a mixed background certainly, as does the fact that she can speak Old Norse, because how else is she communicating with Amleth? So in the background, actually, the Northman already has this mixed culture, particularly as it ascertains to Eastern Europe. Another really neat little feature that nods to this is the accent in English of the slaves on Iceland, which are not accidental at all. We hear a lot of the women speaking in Scottish accents inside the house, and many of the slaves have Irish accents. Now, this is a bit of a nod to in the sagas we hear about a lot of people with Irish names on Iceland, particularly slaves, but also some freed people too, and also to mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA from the mother's line, which connects to modern Icelanders to people from Ireland and particularly the Hebrides, islands off the Scottish coast in the northwest. So many of their ancestors were likely brought to Iceland as slaves, some also potentially as higher class marriages during the settlement era. So again, there's a nod to mixing of different cultural groups, just not really racial mixing, because as I said, for the time period that would be far rarer to see, but you do have this mixing of different cultural groups there. Potentially this is something for a different video, but you can indeed set a film in the Viking Age and accurately portray people of different races. As I mentioned, the Vikings sailed along the coasts of North Africa, where they likely met people with a different colour of skin. Same thing in Spain, which at the time, large parts of Spain had been conquered by the Moors, who were largely Berbers, but also some Arabs, and perhaps some sub-Saharan Africans too. We could even go the other way onto the Eastern Steppe with the Kievan Rus and others, where they were meeting various nomadic tribes a lot of the time, some of them Turkic, some of them the Khazars, for example, who had adopted Judaism as their religion. Also, the Vikings' interaction with the Arabs when they were either fighting for or against the Byzantines at the time. There is great scope for that kind of thing, not to mention their interaction on Greenland with the Thule, the ancestors of today's Inuit, and the group that was there before them, the Dorset culture. And later, of course, also when they crossed over onto continental North America, where they met potentially the ancestor of the, is it the Mi'kmaq, it's meant to be pronounced, native groups. So there is 100% scope for it, but I feel if you want to make a historically accurate film, then you can't have most people in Scandinavia or a large number of people with a different skin color, because I simply don't think there's evidence for that in historically accurate contexts. Some certainly, but it wouldn't have been the norm, which is why I think the Northman has got the cast that it has. But feel free to disagree with me in the comments below, and any evidence to the contrary I would honestly love to see and discuss. So the final point here is negative portrayals of Christianity. Now, it doesn't really apply to the Northman, because are there any portrayals of Christianity in the Northman? There aren't many that I'm aware of, and in fact the film takes place in an almost entirely pagan milieu, with various interplays between Amleth's veneration of Odin, a god who's often associated with the martial upper classes, and Freyr, which is more a common man's god connected to fertility, which is honoured by Fjolnir, perhaps symbolic of his transition from being more of an aristocrat, more of a king, to then going to a lowlier status as a sheep farmer, where obviously the agricultural side of things is much more important, and the land and fertility, which is why he honours Freyr as opposed to Odin. I thought that was an interesting interplay between them, Amleth calling his Freyr a god of erections, and some of the statues there are very well endowed in the film. But again, there's not really any Christianity in it. Now, I know that white supremacists have in the past co-opted quite a lot of pagan things, but again, pretty much everything that I saw in the Northman, you can see the influence of Neil Price in a lot of it, from the elements of the Oseberg ship, what we know occurred there in the burial, as well as, of course, Ibn Fadlan's account there, and Neil Price's performance, theatre, burials, things like that, and a lot of the symbolism behind it with, when Amleth is beaten up and hung up, he has, one eye swollen, so it looks like he has one eye. He's rescued by ravens, all this kind of thing comes back into it. So that's pretty much gone through the paragraph and explained why I disagree that this film does actually meet this criteria from this Stormfront website about why The Northman would then be some kind of great white supremacist film. I can see why some people who are white supremacists do indeed see this as being this is our kind of film. But I think as soon as you sort of read, you look at the background particularly and start to actually think about it, it really shows that it isn't, that it promotes a kind of hybrid cultures in many ways. Indeed, with the children of Amleth being a mixture of Norse and Slavic, and also that the film is just very dark. I think a really good review that I read of the film, which was shared by Tom Fairfax, just said that everyone seems to be hurtling towards their own death. Of course, that is slightly related to the fact that you have the Norns, the three spinners of fate, and that fate is fixed, wyrd bith full arer, as they say in The Last Kingdom, that you can't escape your fate and therefore you just have to take it. But it's very violent, the film. I enjoyed it a lot, don't get me wrong, but I think that in some way may be appealing to more radical white supremacist types in a way. But I think when you really look deeper into the film, that it's really not a dog whistle of any kind, and that it shows these connections that the Norse had with other parts of the world. And indeed that the women in the film seem to be the savvier, perhaps more intelligent ones, while the men are running around and getting themselves killed. Now, I'm very open to criticism. I realize some of this may be somewhat controversial to someone somewhere, so I would love to see the comments in the comment section. I do ask everyone to please remain civil in the comments. It would be great to have a good discussion, but I don't want there to be lots of insults and, angry people commenting all the time. Let's just take a breath, have a sip of water, and then discuss the Viking Age, because it's the period that I absolutely love, and I would hate it, if more terrible crimes were committed in its name, when there are so many people out there, I think the large majority, who are interested in this period because it's just an interesting period, because they don't want some kind of one race utopia today. They just want to study the Viking Age in peace and quiet and enjoy a good film and some beautiful diamond twill.